like flooding resiliency and energy efficiency in homes. Since RGGI is not a new idea, we have a lot of data. States across the country that are members of RGGI have seen consistently lower carbon emissions than non-RGGI states. That's a fact. In 2020, the General Assembly mandated that Virginia participate in RGGI, and Governor Youngkin thinks he can do a runaround of the legislature, but that's not the case. Dispatching clean sources is a direct correlation to decreased sector emissions, and that is why the Sierra Club Virginia chapter and a wide coalition of partners are working to ensure that the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative is not repealed in the 2023 session. We saw attempts last year to remove Virginia as a member state from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and thankfully those attempts failed. I want to speak briefly about the Virginia Clean Economy Act. It's something that a lot of folks have heard about, but the details are numerous. The Virginia Clean Economy Act is over 150 pages long. It was passed in 2020, and like I said, is the most ambitious attempt to deliver a clean energy future in the South that's ever passed. And much like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, it's also working. Just today, the Commonwealth of Virginia Offshore Wind Project was approved, and as I mentioned, Virginia continues to rise in the rankings of states in terms of how much solar it installs. The Virginia Clean Economy Act will make our entire generation of electricity in Virginia carbon-free by 2050. And it also sets utilities targets to meet energy efficiency standards, because as we know, the more energy efficiency, the less energy consumed. This is how we drive down prices for consumers and reduce the need to generate more electricity in the meantime. The VCEA writ large is driving a new clean economy for Virginia. It's creating jobs in renewable energy sectors. It will drastically create thousands of jobs in the offshore wind sector as the project moves forward, and it's reducing dangerous air pollution across all Virginia communities. In addition, there's an added benefit of the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Over the past year, the market fluctuations of commodity pricing like oil, gas have skyrocketed, and it has caused Virginia's utilities to add tons of costs to their Virginia ratepayers' bills. Just this year, the average customer of Dominion Energy saw a $15 a month increase to their bill because of the cost of fossil fuels. The quicker we can remove fossil fuels as the dominant source of electricity generation in Virginia, the quicker we will stabilize bills forever. Renewable energy has no fossil fuel charges and no market fluctuations. But the Virginia Clean Economy Act is under attack. Governor Youngkin in his recent energy plan called for the Virginia Clean Economy Act to be delayed and reevaluated in favor of his natural gas industry friends. Last year, we saw attempts to repeal the Virginia Clean Economy Act happen around 25 times, and we successfully defeated all of them thanks to the support that you all give us and for the work that we do together. As I mentioned, I also want to touch on clean car standards and why it's so important. As I mentioned, the transportation sector in Virginia is accounting for over 40% of our air pollution. So what can we do about it? Well, we have one option. Under the Federal Clean Air Act, states can only regulate the emissions that come out of tailpipes one of two ways. They can use the federal standards, which are weak, or they could use the standards set by California, which exist under a waiver under the Clean Air Act. The California standards are stricter, and they drive air pollution down faster, and that's our goal. In a line with almost every single auto manufacturer, we expect that all of them will be producing only electric cars by 2035, which means we need advanced clean car standards for another reason. Under the legislation, every year, the percent of electric vehicles delivered for sale in Virginia by manufacturers that are EVs or hybrid EVs must rise. Starting in 2024, it needs to be 8% of new cars, all the way up until 100% of new cars in 2035. This is in line with what the automakers are doing, but it's also the quickest and most efficient way to drive down tailpipe pollution in Virginia, because as you'll see at the top, 40% of Virginia's air pollution is coming from cars. The Advanced Clean Car Standards program is under attack by Governor Youngkin. He wants it repealed. So far, as we sit here on December the 15th, with session not starting for about another month, there are already 8 pieces of legislation introduced in the General Assembly to repeal these auto emission standards. We are prioritizing this because we know it's the top source of air pollution in Virginia, and that we need to align Virginia with the manufacturer's stated goals to ensure that Virginians have the opportunity and choice in what car they buy. I'll flag also that the Advanced Clean Car Standards is dealt a couple of lies very often. Governor Youngkin says that it bans the sale of gas-powered cars, and that's not true. All used cars that are gas-powered and any new cars that are gas-powered will still be able to be purchased. You'll be able to buy a used car from a friend, from a family member, and on a used car lot forever. Has nothing to do with Advanced Clean Car Standards, but Governor Youngkin and his allies twist the facts to avoid having to make this decision. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to McKenna Dunbar, who's our building electrification lead on the Sierra Club Virginia chapter staff, who's going to talk to you a little bit about what we can do on offense. All of the things that I just discussed are progress that we have already made here in Virginia on climate and climate action and environmental remediation. But there's more that we can do. We don't just need to play defense. We can offer legislators an opportunity to move forward on policies that will benefit our climate, our environment, and our communities. The work that McKenna is doing on the building electrification program at the Sierra Club is really inspiring and an awesome path forward for climate action in Virginia. McKenna?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Connor. My name is McKenna Dunbar, and I'm the Building Electrification Lead for the Virginia chapter. And I will be speaking briefly on our building electrification campaign as a whole, and then get into the more of the nitty-gritty on the Solar on Schools work that will be present in the upcoming General Assembly session. As it relates to building electrification, our campaign really bolsters a central aim of the Virginia Clean Economy Act by supporting the decarbonization of Virginia's electricity grid by 2045. As many of you may know, building electrification refers to the shift away from fossil fueled powered appliances and sources of electricity to cleaner forms of electricity. And this can take place in a commercial environment, residential environment, as well as other types of properties. As it relates to solar on schools, you may ask, how can schools be a part of advancing this clean energy transition? Well, it's important to note on the next slide that building electrification really will support the work that all of us are collectively engaged in as it relates to the clean energy transition. And this is reflected in the sense of these following facts. For one, building electrification greatly reduces greenhouse gas emissions in all utility territories today. And for the average house that uses appliances like a gas water heater and furnace, electrification can cut household emissions by a significant margin. And in Virginia, the commercial and residential building sector comes in second and third place for energy consumption by end use alone, which is quite significant when we are looking at it from a wider picture. And the EIA really, they stated that in 2021, it was estimated that natural gas accounted for nearly 60% of Virginia's utility scale electricity net generation, which means that half of our electricity comes from natural gas-fired power plants. And shifting into the solar on schools focus, the Solar on Schools work that we are engaged in complements the building electrification campaign as a whole and answers the question of how can schools be a part of advancing this clean energy transition. So in line with our goals of promoting a clean energy future rooted in sustainability and equity, as well as environmental justice, the collective work that all of us are engaged in really emphasizes the imperative role that net zero schools play in the fight against the climate crisis. And in order to both withstand and mitigate the disastrous impacts that this phenomenon has brought to present society, we really must rapidly integrate our state economy into this clean energy transition by promoting energy equity and efficiency. And in a time of widespread climate consciousness, we really must act as agents for change who will drive an aggressive energy transition forward for all electric buildings, particularly with schools. And this is really reflected in the grand investment of time and production of scale it takes for mass clean technology integration to be made accessible and affordable in society, in addition to shifting the general social thought to really internalize the impending dangers that climate change brings to each and every one of us, for children, for school-age children, for young adults, for older populations, for vulnerable populations, because if not now, then when? The path to a decarbonized future really addresses a crisis of care as much as it is about a crisis of action. And in that sense, solar schools can not only lower energy consumption, emphasize environmental stewardship in communities, it also encourages programming in a sustainable programming in a major emission sector of our nation. And as you can see, there's many opportunities that solar has with schools, with powering schools with low-cost solar. Not only can school districts combine solar with energy efficient design and construction to build and renovate schools, these schools can produce as much energy as they consume. They can also reduce a building's ecological footprint and instill a more holistic understanding of a student's environment, as well as their promoting their educational success. And with the state legislation expanding the need for local governments and school districts to install on-site solar arrays using power purchase agreements, there is a greater opportunity for schools to really take advantage of these measures, and especially with new Inflation Reduction Act related expenditures and appropriations in the built environments sector related to energy efficiency and building electrification. And for this reason, school districts should pursue net zero in all new construction projects and set goals to substantially reduce energy use in all major renovations. That is what we are a proponent for. And not only have I mentioned these opportunities, net zero schools cost less to operate over time and provide opportunities for hands-on learning for students and reduce costs for weather-related events, and also create healthier indoor environments in schools, especially since there are no federal mandates that dictate indoor air quality. So better education and long-term savings are possible. For the next portion of the presentation, on the next slide, Senator Favola will act as the Senate sponsor, while Delegate Subramaniam will be the House sponsor. And this past General Assembly session, SB 260, which our work is based on, passed the Senate, but failed to pass in the House General Laws Committee, mostly along party lines. And despite a pre-existing exemption under paragraph D, Republicans objected to paragraph F's perceived mandate for net zero schools due to the requirement for a locality to conduct a cost analysis before exercising the exemption. And so they considered it to be overly burdensome for the school communities. Originally, our policy recommendations surrounded 3 items. One was requiring new school buildings and substantially renovated school buildings to have on-site solar arrays and to be designed and built to net zero standards with solar ready roofs, which enabled the addition of solar at no upfront cost through various financing mechanisms. And then another portion was to create create a school superintendent ombudsman position that would be responsible for working with the school division leaders, school board members, and contractors to save ratepayer money and make these buildings healthier. And their basic duties would include supporting school divisions on the design and redesign of the design and redesign phase of the private solar installation for the consultations. And we also offered that the General Assembly should create a gap fund for school divisions to access within the design or redesign phase of a school building. But the full text is in front of you and is also available in the online PDF version of the Virginia Conservation Network's Our Common Agenda for 2023. And as it relates to changes for SB 260 legislation, line 54 would now specify that the roof of a school or public building with the structural capability to have an increased load, it would more narrowly define the type of roof that this line specifies, while line 58, the change to line 58 would now expand on who would determine the practicality of solar panels by basically stating that school boards or the governing locality, the governing body of the locality can elect this equipment and not just the governing body of the locality. So it expands that definition. And then another notable change is that line 73 would now include school district, the phrase school district alongside a locality entering the design or redesign phase of, or the design phase of a new building. And we also added language to the section that ensures that schools are covered by the requirement that the localities adhere to high performance building standards and the installation of solar ready roofs, because it is not clear that an existing law applies to schools as well as local government buildings. So there was a need to refer to schools specifically. And again, a school can be made to net zero at no additional cost if the solar roof is planned for in advance and if it is designed to already perform at a high standards. And it's really in the best interest of taxpayers and students, school boards, teachers to take full advantage of solar by making these schools all electric and using good design principles and collaboration to really make this roof design the standard. And so under the Inflation Reduction Act, there are added incentives, as I mentioned earlier, which we are still investigating. And our hope is that the changes that were proposed will make passage of the bill in a month or so for the upcoming General Assembly session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, McKenna, for that overview. And as you can see, the work that we are involved in here at the Sierra Club is really complicated and really hard to follow sometimes because of all the federal laws that are sometimes dropped on us at the last second before we could even get the last law right. Thank you so much, McKenna, for that and for all of the work that you're doing on this very important topic. It's really important to the Sierra Club that we present to the legislature not only an opportunity to defend the progress that we've made so far, but an opportunity to continue it. And we believe that we are really meeting that goal with the excellent work that McKenna is doing. So here's what we know and how we're going to protect the progress and advance the progress. We know Governor Youngkin is introducing a plan to roll back all of the progress that we've talked about so far tonight because he said he will. The legislation will be based on previous years, and so we know all our priorities will be under attack, and for the most part, we know where the attacks will come from. But we also know that the most effective way to convince a legislator about a vote is to ensure they're proactively, equitably, and emphatically hearing from the constituents in their districts. So how will we do that? We have an awesome team at the Sierra Club Virginia chapter of staff and volunteers that are going to work every single day to drive emails and phone calls to legislators' offices on key topics and during key moments. We're going to work aggressively with our lobbying team to ensure that all of our priorities are actively tracked and protected. We're going to work with our communications team to release prompt and accurate information that offer easy to use opportunities for engagement. And we know we can be successful if we do the work together on time, if we do it on message and with a cohesive spirit, because over the past several years, we have proven that we can do it. So you might be asking yourself, how can we do it? And how can we do it effectively? And maybe even more importantly, you're asking yourself, what other factors are at play that make doing this even more important? So for that and more, I'm going to turn it over to Tim, our communications manager, who's going to go through some brief slides. Tim?
Thank you, Connor, and thank you again to McKenna. One of the things I miss about in-person meetings, while also recognizing the benefits of webinars and the accessibility it creates, is that you don't get applause. Most people have black screens. I see Bob Shippey is the only one on the screen that I can see. He's waving the fist, which is nice. But I tell people all the time that I work with some of the smartest and most effective advocates that I've ever had in the entirety of my career. And I think McKenna and Connor just showcased why I say things like that. So thank you again for everyone who's here. We now see what's at stake, what the progress we've been able to accomplish together, the opportunity for growth to make Virginia a national leader in climate action. And, you know, when you live in a state that is as purple as ours, things are constantly ebbing flowing. You know, we can't always rely that one party's going to get power or the other. One election is going to go our way. We have to be the difference, because that's how we not just sustain progress, but also increase it. And so that's what essentially this is. What we're going to talk about next is part of a condensed version of something that I and some of the other staff members give to some more grassroots and civic oriented groups and different stakeholders that are interested in really having a influential and effective mark of the General Assembly session. So, Connor, I'm going to click this, act like what's it? I have some animations. So if you just want to click through to get everything out, but we'll quickly go over this. This is just the Schoolhouse Rock version of what the Virginia General Assembly is. I always describe it as Virginia's Congress. It does everything the Congress does for the most part, but it's specific to Virginia. So the makeup of it is 100 House members, and I believe that these statistics might actually, the demographic makeup might be altered given the last election, but that is, oh, I'm sorry, that should be, that's an old number, sorry. Didn't look at this, I forgot to update the slide. But yes, we have a majority of Republicans in the House and a majority of Democrats in the Senate. Very slim margin in the Senate in terms of Democrats, it's only by one. So one member of the Democratic Party decides to break ranks with everyone else. That goes on to the lieutenant governor, who breaks ties, similar to the vice president and everything else. Again, Schoolhouse Rock version, powers of all the General Assembly members, same thing as in any Congress member. They can write and introduce bills, they vote on legislation of whether or not it should become law, and they serve on varying types of committees and decision-making bodies. So that's a quick version that you all probably know about. So let's just move on to the next slide. We need to talk about the need for advocacy and why it's important. And Connor may just jump in here at any time. But I think it's important for folks to realize the demographics of the General Assembly members. Now, it's not saying this because I'm making assumptions about them, but here's what we know. Behavioral science and study after study shows that lived experience can absolutely influence the priorities of leaders. We know that that's the case, and it makes sense. If you have a lived experience, you feel closer to connection to it, you'll be more passionate about it, you'll be more likely to want to fight for it in a position of power. So it's important to have a context about what that looks like in terms of what is the likely thing, or what's the likely topic that our leaders are going to be focused on, what's going to be on their radar. So quickly, going off of just the baseline demographics, we have a majority of men in the legislative session, although this is greatly increased over the last 4 years. It used to be like half the numbers in terms of this. When it comes to people who represent people of color with different racial backgrounds that are non-white, we have 29 out of 140 members total. That, again, is something that has greatly improved. And that is great because Virginia is a very diverse state. We're actually one of the most diverse states in the country. It is always a good thing to have a clash of perspectives. And when that's missing, we have harder times challenging the status quo that may be harmful. Let's look at occupations. Same kind of deal. This is very important to focus on. So business people, lawyers, what they categorize as public affairs or lobbyist professionals, they make up over 50% of all the General Assembly members. When it comes to direct service for public good, it's very much in the minority. When it comes to education, and we have struggling issues of education in Virginia. By the way, we rank worse in a lot of different metrics, not because of our teachers. I want to make that very clear, but because of the lack of support that they have been given on the state level. But we only have 8% of all of our legislators are educators. When it comes to medical professionals, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about pollution. When we have the actual direct impacts of what can be making us sick, that's an important perspective to have, but only 5% of our legislators are medical professionals. When it comes to nonprofit community workers, people who are actually in neighborhoods that may or may not be affected by particular issues, or like really working with the everyday people, the people who make up, the backbone of our state, only 6% of our General Assembly members have that occupation. And when it comes to transportation, as one of the most salient issues in the climate movement, we only have one member, which makes up 0.73%. That represents that occupation. And again, I want to underscore this, that it's not saying that these groups of people can't care about issues outside of of their lived experience, or they can't learn about these things. It's just that what they'll naturally have a perspective of is influenced by their occupation, their demographic. We just know that that's going to be the case. So I'm certainly not trying to talk down about any of these groups of people. What I'm saying is that if you have a perspective that is different from these, that needs to be added on. If you have a perspective that is different from the majority of, from a representation that's not covered here, or is covered here but only in a very small minority, it will not necessarily be part of the discussion and the dialogue or the prioritization that goes on with the General Assembly and the direction of the General Assembly. So we can go to the next one. Go ahead and click it, Connor. I should have removed the animations for this, folks. That's on me. This is the other one. And again, I'm going to say very similar thing because I don't want to misconstrue what we're about to talk about. But at the end of the day, money in politics is something that happens. And it is something that I think needs to be surfaced because it can influence the perspective that we're talking about. It can, there's a group of folks of special interest who support my campaign, support my work, can help me get reelected. That doesn't mean you're always going to vote with those folks 100% of the time, or even all the time, but it does mean that they'll probably pick up the phone. It probably does mean that you've been exposed to their perspective prior to this. So that might be something that clashes with our goals, with our direction with the direction that we believe the state needs to go into. So if we're looking at the reality of that, Over half of all the General Assembly members have accepted at least a third of all of their campaign contributions from private special interests. So that is part of our political system. It's certainly not unique to Virginia, but private special interest does not always overlap with public good or public interest. And that just needs to be acknowledged. And then when it comes to someone who, an organization, you know, a monopoly utility, that is very much a thorn in our side with some of the legislation that they want to introduce. Well, they are a top donor for both political parties. So this isn't about being a Democrat or Republican. This isn't about being conservative or liberal. This is about making sure that regardless of what party we represent, there has to be a perspective of advocates, of public advocates, that is present in the General Assembly. Because if it's not, then the things that we fight for, the things that everyone on this call believes in, may not be present in the moments that are key to decision making. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is just quickly the Schoolhouse Rock. It just kind of breaks down in more specifics what happens in the General Assembly lawmaking process. You know, a General Assembly member has an idea for a law, and oftentimes the idea can come from them. It can come from an advocacy group like us. It can come from you know, a lobbyist group, a contract lobbyist group. I should make that distinguishing. And then or it can be from a constituent, one of the people they represent. That actually happens quite often. They call that a bill by request. Then they send the bill to the Division of Legislative Services. The Division of Legislative Services drafts it into legal language so that it fits what we call what's called the Virginia Code. That's just another way of saying Virginia laws language. And then the legislator becomes the chief patron. They're the people who can play the most crucial role in terms of the inside baseball, passing the bill, making sure that the bill is understood. Committees is really, 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 really important when it comes to the General Assembly session. That's where a lot of the public action, so to speak, takes place. What the process is, once a bill is introduced in the House, the Speaker assigns it to a different committee based off a different topic. So if it's a climate bill, it could go to, you know, the Agricultural Committee or the Commerce Committee, which deals with energy and economic. You know, it just plays into those things. The committee will look up that bill from the chair. The chair introduces the bill, will bring the bill up during a committee hearing that is public, that anyone can go to. Then they hear testimony. Testimony can come from experts, from constituents, et cetera. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then they vote on the action, which is another thing. I don't want to go too far. Then, just quickly, you all probably know this, has to pass a majority in one of the chambers. 51 in the House, 21 in the Senate. And once they do that, before something called crossover, it goes to the other side. And then we have to start the committee process and the advocacy process all over again. Then the governor signs the bill after that. In Virginia, we are unique because we do line item vetoes, which just means the governor can be like, I don't like this part, I'm going to take it out. That's not the case for a lot of states. Also, when it comes to budgetary stuff, the governor can cross something out and be like, I want this instead. And that just happens in Virginia, or they can just fully veto it. Vetoes, though, are reviewed in April and have to get approval from the General Assembly, whether it's a line item veto or an outright one. And if the governor does sign it, though, laws go into effect in July 1 of that same year, unless it's something written into the bill that says, you know, this needs to go into case earlier than that or later. So that is the quick overview. So how can we be a part of the process? Well, number one, there's lobbying. And lobbying is not something that is relegated to advocacy professionals like myself and my other colleagues. If you are a constituent of your representative, then you are entitled to having an audience with them. And if they seem like they're too busy, or if you're worried you're too busy or you're intimidated by their status, don't be, because that's what they signed up for. That is what they're supposed to be. If you're going to be a public servant, that means you have to be accountable to the people you represent. And it's pretty easy to schedule a lobby meeting. Although if you wait to the General Assembly session, their schedules might be booked up. But all you have to do is contact them and ask for one. Even if it's a phone call or an email exchange, it's very simple to set up one. And then once you have an audience with the elected official, I should say that it's not necessarily going to be the General Assembly member. It might be the legislative assistant. or chief of staff, which is perfectly fine. And sometimes that's actually an advantage because the LAs and the chiefs of staff are the ones who make sure that the train keeps running. They have to do an awful lot of research and make sure that they're giving insight and advice to the people that they work for all the time. Connor was a legislative assistant and probably can speak to that. I believe Connor, even though he's in a black void, is giving a thumbs up right now. The things to do in a lobby meeting is the biggest things to remember is you want to leave an impression. It's not about having all the facts and figures, although that type of evidence is important, but it's making sure that when you leave that meeting, that person you're speaking to is going to remember it. They're going to remember having that discussion with you. And the way you do that is, number one, explaining why you care about an issue. It's not enough to just be like, hey, this is a one pager, that's filled with some data on this. I'm asking you to support this bill. But if you say, I care about climate change because my children and grandchildren deserve a future that has as much possibility and as much potential as mine has, then you already set down and legitimize your sincerity around the issue. And that sticks out. Same thing about when you want to use your bona fides about what district you're in and talking about your ties to the community. That can really elevate the impression that you can make. We always want to bring a handout because they meet with dozens of people every single day. So if you have just something a little bit that says, here's why I feel about the way that I issue, usually it's like, I care about the Clean Economy Act because of X, Y, and Z. That's always good for them to have reference because they have to think about thousands of bills or get exposed to thousands of bills every session. It's really important to have something that they can reference in the future. But I will tell you, and I've heard this from multiple different elected officials, I've seen it during my time when I've lobbied the General Assembly, that personal stories is one of the greatest arguments that you can rely on. It is one of the most persuasive tactics that we can rely on. Because again, it's one thing to say this will help 12% of people in this area, but it's another thing to say is my kid has asthma and we live near a coal plant and he just seems to be getting worse and worse. And I don't know what to do. I'm just afraid. And if we don't do something to hold fossil fuel accountable, it's not just gonna be my kid who's hurting. It's not just gonna be my loved one who suffers. It's going to be more of them. And no one should have to live like that. Now that would be, that's an example I just thought of right now, but that's something that they can remember, something where they can put a face to a certain extent, whether it's yours, the person you're talking about, to an issue. Some of the biggest challenges that people think are obstacles of preventing people from lobbying or lobbying effectively is viewing the General Assembly members as celebrities. We have this automatic idea that they must be something special, that they must be someone who, defied the odds to get where they are. At the end of the day, our General Assembly is part-time legislators. They work throughout the year, sure, but this is not their predominant job. They're not experts on the subject matter that they are going to be exposed to, even if they're on that committee. This is just a part-time gig for them. And that means that they're not always we can't think of them as like some special policy wonks. They're going to be expertise in any particular area, although there are some very special people that are like that. Most of them are not. Most of them need us to be able to educate them and expose them to the right perspective. Now, the things that it's on the don't list, it's not worth fighting with people. It's not worth having a debate. Say why you're there, say why you care, say what your argument is. But if you get into a whole tussle about these things, that doesn't help the cause, because people in power can be fragile beings just like the rest of us. Straying from the point, I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. You want to stay on message, you want to stay consistent. In comms, we always say if you have 3 good messages in core one, stay on those. Don't try to go somewhere else, because then they might associate your support for something with a myriad of other ideas. And then the same thing, this comes back to the personal story, only bringing up facts and figures and studies. Connor and our legislative team and all the people who've helped us with this are so fantastic in making sure that they are equipped with the right evidence on the academic side. What we need supplemental assistance with is making these issues more human. And so if you're only bringing up facts and figures and studies, it's not as compelling. But being able to, again, think about why you're passionate about something, that's how we can have a fully formed and persuasive argument. All right, let's go to the next one, Connor. Great, thank you. Understanding committees. So committees are gatekeepers. That's how you should think about them. They decide whether or not a bill lives or dies or goes to the next phase of the process. These, in some ways, they're easier to advocate with. In some ways, they're harder. But they're designed by topic. So the education committee, they have they will get bills that are related to education for the most part. They all have subcommittees. We'll say with the education committee, they'll have a higher education committee, again, and a pre-K education committee. That's kind of what it is. So a bill gets introduced committee. Sometimes it's like, we're going to send this out to a lower committee. They're going to discuss it and see whether or not we voted for it. An important distinction, if you're tracking legislation, which we'll talk about, is that House subcommittees can kill a bill. The Senate subcommittees can't. They can only recommend to kill a bill. So if your bill is going to a subcommittee in the House, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of the danger or risk that it's facing than if you were in the Senate. This is like parliamentary procedure. It's weird, but essentially the language that they use, if you're following these on a live stream, now that our committees are all live streamed, you can check them out, or if you're there in person. In order to have something happen with the bill, one member has to move and one member has to second. That just means one person says, I want to do this, and then one other person says, I agree. That's the whole thing. That's the magic words to make something happen, to create an action. Biggest thing, I've listed things out here. I'm not going to go them by one by one, but if we want your bill to succeed, the word you want to hear is report. If the committee votes to report, I move to report, I second moving to report, and then everyone vote, and then the majority votes to report, the bill moves on. Not report and refer, that just sends to a different committee, or refer, that's it. The only way that our bill moves on is if it reports. Let's go to the next one. All right. Similar to lobbying, it's about leaving an impression. If you're engaging a committee, there's some things you should be aware of. But the biggest thing I want to say to tell folks, which is a key piece of the advocacy training that we provide, is that anyone can speak at a committee. Anyone, doesn't matter how old you are, what you look like, how much money you make. If you can be there and present or on the live stream, you are allowed to speak at a committee. What will happen is they'll look at the bill, there'll be some discussion, and then the chair will say, is there anyone in the room who's in favor of this bill who would like to talk? Or if there's anyone on the live stream, if they're still doing that. And then once those folks have a chance to speak, they'll do the same thing, but for opposition. That's how it works. And this is one of the most crucial moments in advocacy, especially grassroots advocacy, because that's when they can see public support and hear from people directly. This is also important because the media is present. Well, they're not allowed to be on the floor and ask questions right there, but they can record. Actually, a lot of my job in the General Assembly is going to reporters during the committee and saying, hey, do you want me to talk about what just happened and how we feel about it? But what's also important from a grassroots advocacy side is that if someone tells a really compelling story, it could make the news the next day. I've seen this happen time and time again. I always tell the story about how there was this woman advocating for Medicaid expansion, and her son was in something called the Medicaid gap. Essentially, he was getting it what he could if they changed the law. And she said, please vote for this bill because my son, he was born without the right valve of his heart, and he has to be on medicine that keeps him alive and keeps him able to work, but he can only work part-time. And the medicine that literally keeps him from dying is $500 a month, and the twice yearly checkup that he needs to get to make sure that his body is functioning properly is $10,000 each time. And my husband and I, who are ready to retire, who've worked our whole lives, will bankrupt ourselves because what parent wouldn't do that for their kid? That story made the front page of the Richmond Times-Dispatch 12 hours later. So don't discount yourselves. There's an awful lot of people in suits with some fancy words and arguments, but if your story is powerful, that could be the one that's the most noticeable. When you testify to a committee, it's very important to just follow decorum that has been set prior to this, thanking them for their time, thanking the chair for letting you speak, saying where you're from. That always helps, especially if a member that represents you is on the committee, and then speak about the personal impact like my story just did. And you usually only get a few seconds, 30 minutes, 2 minutes if you're lucky. There's 30 seconds, excuse me, 2 minutes if you're lucky. So keep them brief, and then you just thank them again and leave. And that's what you can do, knowing that you got to be there and speak to people in power with your own words. That is the power of committees, and that's why we need people to show up when they can. And sometimes just having a bunch of people in line saying, I support this bill, please vote for this bill, one after one, that can also have a major impact. All right. We'll quickly go with tracking legislation, and that's it. So we're ahead of schedule, so great. So we'll hold back on this one. So tracking legislation is pretty easy. We have the legislative info. It's easy if you know the tricks. It's not the most user-friendly thing. So this is from the Legislative Information Services. This is where most of us rely on tracking legislation. It's not updated in real time, but it's the quickest one that's updated. So when there's activity with a bill that you may or may not be following, this is where we go. On their homepage, you can click Bills and Resolutions, which goes to this. You can look at all legislation. You can do it. You can look at it from particular members. So if there's a member that you really like and want to see what kind of priorities they have, you can click on there. There might be a member you really don't like and want to see what kind of BS they're trying to get away with this session. Same deal. You can look at it from there. You can look at what bills are in which committees at what time by clicking committee. And then of course there's by subject. I will say that LIS by subject is not the best. If you want to look up a bill by topic, then Virginia Public Access Project would probably be a little bit better in terms of typing in those search words, climate change, whatever, resiliency, that kind of thing. All right, so if you click on that, you can usually find your own bill. And this is a bill from last year, one of the myriad of bills that were an attack that Connor was talking about beforehand. This is essentially a repeal of the Clean Car Standards. You know, the thing that helps us get down, reduce our tailpipe pollution, which by the way, is not just our worst source of climate pollution. It is also responsible for premature deaths of over 3,500 Virginians every single year. That's from the Virginia Coalition of Climate Action. This is about people's lives. This is about making sure that we're not just being acting on climate, but also making sure that we're making our communities healthier. This is, again, this is just an example of you can access it, but what's really important is if you want to see where things are going, this is history from last year. All of this is where you can see what happened, but history is not necessarily what happened in the past. It also tells us where the bill might be going. This is full from last year, but we saw that, as you can see from one item, referred to Committee on Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources. That's a link, and if you click on it, it'll take you to the page for that. You can look at the agenda. You can see when it's up. Then you see again that was signed to a subcommittee, and then this is the House, which is not as friendly to this legislation. They recommended reporting, which means passing the repeal of Clean Car Standards. I will just take your attention to something that's really crucial and talks about the fragility of our progress. At the very bottom, you'll see that we defeated the repeal of Clean Car Standards, a significant and salient aspect of climate action, by only one vote in a committee. One vote, that's all it took. And if you click on those, you can see who voted for it. Again, this is voting to repeal. Yeas and nays, just remember, like if it's committees, report is what you want. Everything else kills the bill. You can see who voted to report it, which means to pass on the repeal, and then who voted against that motion, that action. And so you can hold people accountable. You can actually look up their records and make sure that when you're speaking to them or speaking about why you don't approve of their record, that's where you can find that information. So that's just a quick view of tracking legislation. I don't know. I think that might be it. Connor, is that it? Dope. I am hearing the applause in my head. Thank you so much, everyone. Standing ovation. Wow.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I really appreciate you going through that. And you were getting kudos in the chat for the excellent presentation that you were going over on legislative process. And the reason, folks, that at, almost 7 o'clock here on a rainy Thursday, cold Thursday in December here in Virginia, that we are telling you about all of the stuff that Tim just went through, it's because it matters. It is where it matters the most. And the more people that know about this stuff, the better we are, the better our movement is, the better the Sierra Club's priorities succeed. And that is why we aim to spend the time that we do talking with you all about this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen only for the purpose of being able to see the chat. So if everyone could just give me a moment. Terrific. Okay. So like I said, we McKenna and Tim and I have intruded upon your time, but for a good purpose, for a higher purpose, because this information is really important and these policies are really important and they're benefiting Virginia. And since you're all Sierra Club members and took the time to be here, I know that you care about the success of those policies that I talked to and that I talked about and that McKenna talked about, and we'll use the process that Tim talked about to defend them. So what I want to do now is open it up for questions. I see a couple in the chat, so I can start with those. But if you have a question and you would like to type it into the chat, go ahead. We will try and get to as many of them as we can. But before we do that, just either by show of hands on the video screen or by raising your hand on the Zoom chat, could you let us know if you've met with a legislator in Virginia this year or recently? Okay, Tiziana, great. Daryl, great. Douglas, great. Tyla, great. Bob, Daryl, fantastic. Wow, awesome. That's really, really great to see. And really makes us feel good that people are really out there advocating for this work. The first question that I see is from Douglas. Can you talk more about what our paths are for defending Reggie, legislative, litigative, etc.? Sure. So there are two paths to defending Reggie. The first is legislative, and I spoke a little bit about that. We need to defeat the bills that will repeal Virginia's participation as a member state in this coming session. And we are working, I can assure you, really, really hard and spending a lot of time to make sure that is a successful effort on behalf of the Sierra Club. The second path for defending Reggie is what I term a regulatory path. Governor Youngkin, when he took office, also took control, and by control I mean the majority of the people are his appointees, of the Virginia Air Pollution Control Board, which to many folks is a very obscure body, but it's tasked with implementing and managing regulations regarding air quality in Virginia. And the governor, usually when a new governor takes power, he's able to take enough seats on that board to make them his. So folks that he put on the board. You've probably seen in the news recently that the Air Pollution Control Board has been making a couple of decisions. The Air Pollution Control Board, at the behest of the governor and his senior advisor, Andrew Wheeler, have been putting forward what they are calling proposed regulations. In an attempt to confuse people, a proposed regulation is just a deletion of the regulation. So all of the things that you've probably seen about the Air Pollution Control Board recently is the Air Pollution Control Board, at the behest of the governor, advancing the, quote me now, proposed regulations regarding Reggie. But what that actually is a deletion of Reggie. So you may be asking yourself, why is that happening? Well, we don't really know. It's very clear that in the law, the Code of Virginia that Tim described, that Reggie is mandated. The General Assembly put Virginia into Reggie, and only the General Assembly can remove Virginia from Reggie. And so all I can say at this point is that it is our position that a vote by the Virginia Air Pollution Control Board at the behest of the governor to repeal the Reggie regulations in Virginia is not legal. I'll leave you with that. The next question that I see is from Claudia. McKenna, this one looks like it could be for you. Can we push solar microgrids for schools and others in the event of outages? For example, the recent takedown of the North Carolina power grid.
As it relates to a general response to that question, thank you, Claudia, for asking about solar microgrids. That leads to the conversation of distributed solar. And in the state of Virginia, this process would prove to be very complicated due to our monopoly utility company present, who are not fans of distributed solar. So I do agree that solar microgrids can be one of the solutions as we veer towards a clean energy transition. But at this moment, with the relationship that solar advocates and EJ advocates alike have with our energy utility, it is not necessarily the most effective use of our time right now to push for specific micro grid solutions for the next upcoming General Assembly session. But in the future, that can be a topic matter that we can advocate for. And I do agree that the natural disasters and creating resiliency measures around such power outages as reflected in the North Carolina power grid, as well as with Texas last year, really does reflect why we need energy sources that are renewable and that are resilient for community members to feel secure as it relates to the attainment of energy to provide for their energy needs. But I appreciate you asking the question about solar microgrids.
Thanks so much, McKenna. Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to put in the chat? Oh, I see one. Thank you, Brian. Do city and county boards have the ability to modify the Virginia construction code in their districts to require solar installation on new construction? Thank you for that question. And the answer is generally yes, they do. If the school district is in Dominion Energy territory or in some electric cooperatives territory, they are able to do that by simply deciding as a locality, so either as a school board or as a county board, that they would like the school to have solar on it. If they make that decision, they can engage with a solar installer, a company, essentially a solar installation company, and they can contract with that company for something that is called a power purchase agreement, which is an agreement between the solar company and the host site, so a school or a county, and they can put the solar panels on their school if they'd like to. So we do have that option. Tim.
Yes, I just wanted to add, and you can probably speak more to this, that also another underscore of the advocacy, why that's necessary. Virginia is what's known as a Dillon rule state. Essentially, that means is that localities only have the power to make changes in their communities that have been provided that has been given to them by the General Assembly. So the General Assembly says you can do this, they can, but if it passes law that essentially says you can't do this, the localities doesn't necessarily say that it can do this. The localities' hands are tied. This is really important because if we want to make change on our local levels as well, because everything we talked about can also be adopted on that level, they might just be blocked by the fact that the General Assembly has not given them the powers to do so. So it's great when it comes to the solar installation in terms of the accessibility and options that Connor just discussed, but there's also things related to building codes, for example, which we need to make our energy efficiencies better and more improved. Virginia's mandatory energy efficiency standards are at 2008 levels. That's ridiculous. And it's not only just making sure there's excess pollution, but it's also driving up our electric bills. So this is one of those things where we could use the General Assembly to act so that localities can make their communities better, because they deserve the option to do what's best to protect their communities and the people's health. But they can't necessarily, there's only so much they can do without permission from the General Assembly.
Yeah, excellent reminder about the Dillon rule, Tim. And Bob, yeah, also in the chat has also mentioned something that I should specifically clarify, which is that currently they can build solar on schools, but they cannot change the building or construction code related to the school itself. Are there other questions that folks wish to put in the chat to have answered this evening? I see Tiziana.
Hey, sorry, it's typing, I'm moving around. I was just wondering, is there any Like how in trouble, because I haven't been following, to be honest, I've been doing other states work. So how in trouble are we as far as like, do you foresee like any bill being, any initiative, anything we passed in the past that it's actually really in trouble, that some Democrats are thinking about repealing? You know, is there anything that is actually, you think, at risk?
That's a really great question. I think at this point, I would have to say that we are cautiously optimistic. It was the way I'm describing it. I mean, we have done a lot of work, and a lot of other partner organizations that we work with and our volunteers have done a lot of work to reach out to legislators over the past several months and have meetings on those topics. We have not had a meeting go badly. So I'm optimistic that the policies that we described tonight are going to hold in the General Assembly session, but I'll also add to the end of that they won't hold if we don't continue to keep up the pressure that we're putting on. And that's on me and on Tim and McKenna and our staff to be present in the General Assembly building, but it's also on all of us to ensure that we're reaching out and contacting our legislators. So I think I'll frame it as, we definitely have the opportunity to win here.
Thank you. That's good news.
Sure, absolutely. And I do want to also address Paul's question in the chat, which is, I live in Arlington, where our General Assembly representatives are very pro-environment. Is it still worth trying to speak to them one-on-one? Yes, absolutely. There are many members of the General Assembly that are allies to the Sierra Club that we work with often, and we would love to have you meet with them. It is really important for building our relationship. Not only do we want the legislator that may be very pro-environment to vote pro-environment, we want to take that relationship to the next level. We want to then be able to go back to that legislator and say, hey, we have a really cool idea to fix X problem over here. And by the way, it'll also fix Y problem over here. Are you willing to do a bill with us? Once they say yes, that brings that relationship to a whole nother level. Then they become a bill sponsor on behalf of us, and they're willing to introduce legislation on behalf of us. They're willing to testify on behalf of us. And it continues to build that relationship. So all voices in the legislature are really critical. It's not always just the ones that are going to possibly change their mind. It's also building the relationships with the ones that really want to work with us and have worked with us, are willing to work with us, and building up a relationship to the point where we can continue to utilize their voice. So if you have a member of the General Assembly in your district where you look at them and go, well, they voted for everything I wanted them to vote for, do I even need to say anything to them? Yes. And it's probably even going to go really well for you. Tim.
Great question. And I'm just adding on to everything that Connor just said, because it was a complete answer. But I would just wanted to contrast it with the importance of building that relationship is to sometimes tell them, hey, you're being fooled about something. We have had pro-environment people from both parties fall for what we call greenwashing, which is efforts by our opponents, usually polluters, saying this is going to help the environment, when in reality it's going to the opposite. There is a concept known as what they call advanced recycling. It's great branding, but at the end of the day, it's just creating power plants that are run off melting and burning plastic, single-use plastic in particular. They call it recycling, but it's not. And we had an unfortunate bump in the road with some of our important allies who fell for it and voted for a piece of legislation that has created a pathway, or has helped create a pathway, or the start of one, to advanced recycling in Virginia. Advanced recycling is just burning plastic, and it's carbon intensive, and it damages the air quality of the surrounding neighborhoods. But it was packaged as advanced recycling. And if you have that personal relationship with your elected representative, because we're a staff that we can only do so many things in a given time, it's easier for us, instead of just sending out an email, which are important to say, hey, click here to let your legislator know, but also to be able to pick up the phone and saying, I don't like this bill. We've had this relationship. You can trust me to let you know that I think that this is something that is detrimental, even though they're saying the opposite.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. And that makes me think of one other thing, which is, if you have a really great meeting with a legislator, they don't have to be your legislator, but even if they are, if you have a meeting with them and it goes really well, ask them for their cell phone number. As Tim mentioned, these are not celebrities. These are not Hollywood people. You can ask these people for their cell phone number. And you'll see that the more you do that, the more they'll start reaching out to you. I, just because of my job, get a lot of them, but there are volunteers at the Sierra Club who will get a text message from a senator that says, hey, I'm really confused about this thing. I heard it's this, but maybe it's this. What does the Sierra Club think? Question mark, send. And they send that text message out to our volunteers. They certainly send it to me. They certainly send it to Tim. And it's really even more powerful when they're sending it to the volunteers because they know that's a voter in their district and they need to hear their perspective. So don't be afraid to build a relationship, even if you do think that they're good on your issues. And Tiziana's also mentions one other thing in the chat I want to add as well, which is to thank them for when they support our bills. We and every other organization out there has a lot of asks for people who are trying to do things in a very small time. And sure, it's really nice when they get a thank you every once in a while. See, Julie in the chat. We have a new delegate coming in to replace Mark Keem at 35th. Seems like a good opportunity to make. Absolutely, yes. There's a special election in that seat on January 10th. It would be absolutely worthwhile to speak with the victor. And all relationships have to start somewhere. So welcome. The person who wins that race will have their first day as an elected official be the first day of the General Assembly session. So they'll be off to a fast start. Does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to put in the chat to address tonight? I'm gonna give folks a chance to type before, because I know if I say thank you, then someone will say something. So I'm gonna wait. All right. Well, we at the Sierra Club, on behalf of Tim, McKenna, and our acting director, Gustavo, who's with us, our legislative chair, Bob Shippey, who's with us as well tonight, who does amazing work for the Sierra Club Virginia chapter. We want to thank you for joining us tonight, for taking the time out of your schedule, for sitting with us in the rain or snow or sleet or ice, wherever you may be calling from, to learn about the issues that we're prioritizing and how we're going to win together, because we know that as the Sierra Club, we are stronger together, and we are stronger when we act in unison for the changes that we deserve and the changes that our communities deserve. So thank you so much for taking time to join us tonight. Please reach out to the Sierra Club Virginia chapter staff or other volunteer leaders if you have questions that come up along the way. And we look forward to seeing all of you again very soon. I hope you have a safe evening. Good night.